Right into this major headline right now. The World Central Kitchen nonprofit founded by celebrity chef Jose Andres announced on Tuesday that it's pausing all operations in Gaza after 7 of its food aid workers, including a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen, were killed by a quote-unquote unforgivable Israeli airstrike. We're also seeing photos shared of the victims on social media. President Biden himself is also responding to this news, putting out a statement saying in part that he is outraged and heartbroken by the deaths of 7 humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen, including 1 American in Gaza. He also went on to say that they were providing food to hungry civilians in the middle of a war. They were brave and selfless. Their deaths are a tragedy. Meanwhile, Israel has pledged to investigate what exactly took place and how this happened. We want to bring in our next guest here, Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate. He joins us live now to talk more about this. Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's first just begin with the wide range of reaction that we are seeing today and this week, as well as what explanation there is so far for how this occurred.
Well, I think, first of all, obviously it's a terrible tragedy. But I think the reactions have to be judged in the context of the political effort to stop Israel from completing its goal of eliminating Hamas, and not so much about the details of this particular incident. In wars, terrible things happen all the time, and no one should know that better than President Biden, who was part of an administration when Obama was president that used drone strikes and often hit the wrong targets during our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Indeed, as we were withdrawing from Afghanistan in 2021, he personally was involved in ordering a drone strike that wound up killing people, innocent civilians in a house. And that wasn't intentional. It was a terrible mistake, as mistakes always happen in war. I think there is a degree of a willingness to blame Israel, attribute motives to something that isn't motive. Many of the casualties that Israel has itself suffered have been friendly fire casualties during this current conflict since post-October 7th. And as much as I think certainly for the families of those who are lost, their grief is terrible, and I don't blame them for saying pretty much anything, when a loved one is lost. But there's no reason to believe that Israel did this deliberately. Why would they? And indeed, the point is, if you're talking about like who's stopping the aid going into Gaza, the main reason why, if there isn't a food shortage inside Gaza, it's due to Hamas, which steals most of the aid that gets there. And is still conducting a war against Israel. It's not surrendering the hostages. It's not laying down its arms. So therefore, Israel is continuing its efforts to ensure that they could never inflict another tragedy like October 7th on the people of Israel again, allow hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are displaced from their homes, refugees in their own country because of this war that Hamas launched with Iran's encouragement, and because of Hezbollah firing on Israeli territory from the north. So let's put it in perspective. I'm sure those involved will wind up being held accountable one way or the other. Israel has a very serious process for dealing with this sort of situation. It's terribly unfortunate. But the only reason why people are trying to attribute terrible motives to Israel, because they're against Israel to start with. And that's really the context for much of the commentary about this incident.
Well, and you mentioned that this wasn't intentional. However, some members of Congress are saying otherwise, and Chef Jose Andres also making a comment to a reporter from Reuters. Let's pull up what he had to say here on social media, saying in a Reuters interview that the organization was deliberately targeted while delivering aid to Gaza, says Israel and 3 United States must do more to get humanitarian aid in. He questioned how the U.S. could supply aid and military support to Israel. And we also heard from someone who, as we know, has not been quiet about the matter, Representative Rashida Tlaib, the Democrat from Michigan, accusing Israel of killing the aid workers on purpose. I mean, what do you make of their statements here?
Well, Rashida Tlaib's comments should be ignored. She's an open anti-Semite, someone who supports the destruction of Israel, someone who has been supportive of the atrocities committed against Israelis. So anything she says about this conflict should be discounted. As for, the celebrity chef behind this effort, I understand his grief, but if Israel wanted to stop his organization from getting aid into Gaza, they didn't have to have a mistaken, an incident like this. They could have just prevented the trucks from going forward. They haven't been. Israel's been allowing aid into Gaza throughout this entire war, something that is almost unprecedented in the history of warfare. In no other war is one combatant, compelled to allow supplies to enter into the territory of its opponent. That's something the United States never did in any of its wars, but Israel is asked to do that, and they've complied with it, even when it was supposedly blockading Gaza, which was, I might remind everyone, was an independent Palestinian state, an all but name from which Israel had completely withdrawn before October 7th. Convoys of food, fuel, supplies entered Gaza pretty much every day before that. So this idea that Israel's trying to starve the Palestinians is a big lie. Obviously, it's a tragic incident, and whenever tragic incidents happen and Israel is the party that's accused, everyone jumps to the worst possible conclusion. I didn't hear some of these howls of outrage after October 7th from some of the people condemning Israel and attributing foul motives to what was clearly, a friendly fire and an accident in the middle of a war, as opposed to what Hamas does, which is to deliberately target civilians and engaged in a rampage of mass murder, rape, torture, and kidnapping. So let's put this in perspective. The most of these comments are not so much about this incident. They're about opinions about the war and about whether you want Hamas to survive and win this war, as opposed to for Israel to defend itself against a vicious terrorist movement whose only goals are, again, we have to remind people, Hamas's goal is not to end, quote unquote, the occupation, unless you consider the existence of the one Jewish state on this planet to be an occupation. Their goal is to destroy Israel and to further the genocide of Jews living in Israel. So that's what this argument is really about. As tragic as this incident is, most of these comments should be seen in light of where these people were on whether this war is justified at all. And it is a justified moral war, as even President Biden has continually said.
I want to ask you, too, about another major headline. Iran has vowed to retaliate after a strike it blamed on Israel killed 2 of its top commanders and 5 officials at its consulate in Syria. How does that raise the risk of a wider Middle Eastern conflict? As we know, we've been hearing that they don't want this to get any bigger than it already is. But how does that make a difference here?
Listen, Iran has been very open about its goal is to destroy Israel as well. Iran funded and encouraged the October 7th massacres. Hezbollah, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, it's not even a proxy. They take their orders from Tehran. They've been firing on Israel throughout this war. They're engaged in a war against Israel. Israel fights back. They don't get to do this with impunity. And as far as whether this will lead to wider conflict, every time either the United States or Israel strikes at Iran, they always make big threats. But they are somewhat of a paper tiger and always have been. The idea that they will launch a full-scale war over this is not really credible. They are, if they really wanted to join in a full-scale war against Israel, they would have joined in this war against Israel on October 7th. They didn't do that. They were afraid of Israel. They didn't want Israel to strike at Lebanon, at Hezbollah in Lebanon in the way that Israel can, because they don't want to lose that asset. Hezbollah's missiles, its forces in Lebanon are basically Iran's failsafe. They're there to be used if and when the United States or Israel were to act against Iran and its nuclear program directly. They're not going to play that card unless their lives, unless their illegitimate rogue regime is at stake and whether its fate is being decided. So I don't think, as much as one should never discount, when people like the Islamist tyrants of Iran make threats, The idea that they're going to launch a war which they can't win under these circumstances is not really something that I think anybody in Jerusalem or Washington takes completely seriously.
Live now look there out of southern Israel. You know, there's been mixed reaction, especially as of recently, higher levels of disapproval amongst some with Israel's handling of the war so far, obviously amid this worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. How would you describe, though, the relationship right now between the U.S. and Israel, and more specifically between President Biden and the Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu? As we know, they are going to be talking on the phone tomorrow.
President Biden has been trying to topple Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu since Netanyahu won the most recent Israeli election in November 2022. He supported the protest movement against Netanyahu all through last year, which, you know, was a major political controversy leading up, and which ended with the October 7th attacks on Israel. He wants a more pliant and more obedient Israeli prime minister there. And he's also acting, if the relationship is troubled right now, it's not really because as controversial as Netanyahu is, and as, he's not an easy person to like, but the reason why the relationship is in trouble is because of President Biden's perception of his political problems. He thinks, and I think wrongly, that he's losing to former President Trump in the polls, and specifically losing in Michigan because he's losing left-wing voters and Arab American voters who think he's too supportive of Israel. And he wants this war to be over, even if it means Hamas wins, because he thinks that will solve his political problems. He's wrong about that. If he's losing Michigan, it's because of his failed policies on the border, and because of his failed economic policies. It's because working class Americans are turning against this administration, and it's Teamsters and auto workers who are going to be voting for Trump, not the Arab Americans who will stay home. That may cost him Michigan. So this is largely about American politics, not about Israeli politics.
Well, and I want to ask you, too, about, we've seen a lot of protests coming out of Israel over people there really not happy with how Netanyahu has handled things. How would you describe the state of Israel right now and the people there and their reaction to all of this, all the recent events that have been happening?
I think we have to draw a dichotomy. I think much of the commentary in the United States has been mistaken because they see protests against Netanyahu, who is, a partisan figure, just like we have partisan politics in the United States. Israelis are divided politically, just as Americans are divided politically. And, Netanyahu, who has been in power for a very long time, has a lot of enemies, a lot of critics. But the overwhelming majority of Israelis are completely supportive of his policies on the war. They just don't, many just don't like him. And some, obviously his political opponents want a new election, which would be 2 years early. They want to get him out of power for, their own political interests, and many people support that. Some of the same people who were protesting his plans for judicial reform, which were wrongly portrayed in the American press as anti-democratic, when in fact, would have made Israel more democratic, not less democratic. And they want to exploit divisions and protests about, is he doing enough to get the hostages out? I think, I was in Israel recently, and, if you listen to some of the rhetoric of his critics, they act as if he and not Hamas took these poor Israelis who are still being held in Gaza, as if Netanyahu took them hostage, and as if he's holding them in his basement, as if it's up to him whether they're freed. He would like to free them right away. Unfortunately, Hamas is holding them hostage, not Netanyahu. Israeli politics is divisive, and it will play out. There isn't likely to be an election in the middle of a war for America to call upon Israel to hold an election in the middle of the war, as Charles Schumer did, Majority Leader Schumer did in the Senate last month, when in fact they're perfectly okay with Zelensky, in Ukraine canceling elections that were scheduled to be held because of the war there. I mean, it's hypocritical, and it's really, as I said, it's about American politics, not about Israeli politics.
Where does the state of hostage negotiations stand right now? I feel like it was just a couple of weeks ago that I remember watching live on our own stream here, President Biden at an ice cream shop in New York City saying that he's hopeful they're going to reach some sort of ceasefire agreement, temporary deal by the following week. And obviously here we are, and it seems like tensions, if anything, are just escalating. So how are families doing right now? And are they making really any progress, or are they moving backwards?
It's hard to judge from the outside how these negotiations with the Hamas terrorists are going. The one thing I can tell you, Israel already agreed to incredibly, grievous concessions, dangerous concessions to get the remaining, or at least some of the remaining hostages out, freeing terrorists with blood on their hands, agreeing to stop the war, more than Netanyahu would like to give. But the reason why the deal didn't go through is because Hamas keeps saying no. They keep withdrawing. And the reason why they're doing that is that they think that the West will bail them out. They think the longer they hold these hostages, who are very likely, some of them undergoing God knows what torture, God knows what sexual abuse, because they think the protesters against Israel in the West and the pressure from the Biden administration will enable them to win and not to even have to give up the hostages, to force a ceasefire without the release of hostages. They're counting on that. They think they're going to win because of all the people chanting from the river to the sea in the streets of American cities and on college campuses, even though they don't know, they couldn't identify which two bodies of water that is. And many of them don't even understand that that's a slogan that calls for the destruction of Israel. That's why Hamas is holding firm in these talks. It's not because Israel hasn't made concessions. Israel's already made dangerous concessions and agreed to give up a great deal and not even get all the hostages back. But Hamas backs away every time. And those who, for political, domestic political issues, interests in Israel, or because they're against Israel altogether, they would like to blame Netanyahu, would like to blame Israel. That's not the case. As with this entire war, as with every casualty that has occurred during this war, the responsibility for the suffering is wholly due to Hamas.
All right, Jonathan Tobin joining us here, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.